Welcome to our webinar, the 2016 Supply Chains to Admire. I'm your host, Allison Crawford. As many of you know, not all supply chains are created equal. Similarly, not all rankings of supply chain performance are equal. In this webinar, we'll talk about the methodology used to rank the 2016 Supply Chains to Admire and how to improve your performance using quantitative methods and hear how winners achieved their success. But before I hand this over to Lora, there are a few things I want to cover with you. First, we're recording today's session and we'll post it on our on-demand webinar page. You can visit our website to listen to this or any of our other webinars. Additionally, we'll send out the slides to all attendees within 24 hours of the conclusion of the webinar. We encourage you to share these slides with others in your organization, and if you have questions, reach out to Lora or myself to set up a private discussion. We also want to hear your questions about our findings. Please post to the Q&A or chat function to the left of your screen. We've left time at the end of the webinar to address all of your questions. Finally, we'll be live tweeting the webinar, so if you'd like to join in the social media conversation, you can use the hashtag SCIWebinar and the Twitter handle @SCIInsightsLLC during the event. Now, let me introduce Lora Cecere, founder and CEO of Supply Chain Insights. As an enterprise strategist, Lora focuses on the changing face of enterprise technologies. Her research is designed for the early adopter seeking first mover advantage, and she comes to the stage with over 40 years of diverse supply chain experience. So Lora, let me hand the stage over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Allison, and boy, it's great to see 250 people online to hear this webinar. You know, one of the things that people want to know is who does supply chain best and what can we learn from them, and that's really the basis of how we started this research. We wanted to have an objective measurement for our quantitative studies and our qualitative interviews so that we could take in the data and then we could look at some kind of an independent measure to say these companies are powering value. Now, the term value is tossed about a lot, and the supply chain leader has been on a cost-driven journey to really reduce cost, but reducing cost doesn't drive value, and a lot of companies have said to us, Lora, can you help us with a methodology that can take us from a functional, more cost-based view to be able to align end-to-end and drive value to really improve balance sheet results? So that's really the history. We started 3 years ago. The methodology is now in its third year. We've refined it considerably. We wanted to learn, and so as we do, we publish the methodology openly. We invite people to run their own analysis. We do this analysis for divisions within companies. We have some private companies that sign NDAs, and they ask us to compare their company against public companies. And every time we do the analysis with supply chain leaders, we learn a bit more, and so we refine the methodology. As I go through the 2016 methodology, I will explain how 2016 is slightly different than 2015 and what we did in 2014. The process is based upon balance sheet and income statement data. We look at the full year reporting from the prior year, and the Supply Chains to Admire winners are based upon 2009 to 2015 full year public reporting. We source the data from a federated service called Y-Charts, which is openly available to anyone on the call for a fee, and that allows us to get at supply chain ratios. So, for example, we don't compare inventory, either dollars or levels. Instead, we use a ratio. We use inventory turns. And the reason why all of our analysis is based upon ratios is it allows us to compare small companies to big companies and allows us to compare companies across currencies. We wanted a methodology that could be used by all supply chain leaders, not just the biggest guys and not just guys in North America. We wanted to have it to be a methodology that everybody could use to say, how could they measure up? So let's look at what drives the methodology, and just to help people, because I know more people will be familiar with the Gartner Top 25 than the Supply Chains to Admire methodology, and let's just spend a minute to compare these two methodologies. When I worked at AMR, I was part of the team that worked on the AMR Top 25 that became the Gartner Top 25, and it's now in its 13th year, and it's focused against very large companies either in the Global 500 or the Forbes 2000 list, and you have to be at least $12 billion in revenue annually to be able to qualify for the Gartner Top 25. Now, the Gartner Top 25 takes all companies and puts them in a spreadsheet and shakes them up, and 50% is a quantitative measure. The look is at return on assets, which is a 3-year weighted average, inventory turns, which is a 1-year quarterly average, revenue growth, which is a 3-year weighted average, and this year Gartner added a corporate social responsibility index based upon a third party. Now, 50% of the Gartner methodology is quantitative, meaning data-driven, and 50% is qualitative based upon peer ranking and Gartner analyst ranking. Now, when I was an analyst at AMR, the predecessor of Gartner, I never felt comfortable to be 25% of this ranking. Even though I worked with lots of companies, I worked primarily with process-based companies and didn't really feel that I knew the discrete industries that well. So I wanted to create a methodology that would be applicable to all companies, whether it's by size or whether it's a different company in a different country. And I wanted to compare within an industry, because one of the things I have found is the beauty industry is very different than medical device, and medical device is very different than consumer electronics. And so what we do is we divide the companies by NAICS codes, which is a North American industry designation for census reporting, which takes all companies and basically groups them by code, things like hospitals and medical device and household products. And we do that so that we get like companies to compare against. Then what we do is we take the reporting, and this reporting that is actually for the 2016 winners looks over a period of 2009 to 2015. What we find in the research is it takes at least 4 years for companies to drive supply chain improvement that becomes noticeable on the balance sheet. The first 3 years you'll see it in the data, but you usually have a year offset for financial reporting so you can see the pattern. So we're looking at the period post-recession of 2009 to 2015. I'll also share with you what the data would look like if we were using both the pre-recession and the post-recession years of 2006 to 2015. And you'll see that there's some similarities and some differences. But because we wanted it to be a snapshot post-recession, we're awarding the winners to 2009 to 2015. Now, our analysis has 3 different steps. First, we ask the question, is this company within its peer group driving improvement at a higher rate than the norm? We basically stack rank the companies based upon the supply chain index methodology, which we developed 3 years ago, which ranks companies on strength, balance, and resiliency. Strength is an orbit chart which shows the year-over-year balance sheet results at the intersection of operating margin and inventory turns, and asks the question, are companies making progress on those 2 metrics? Balance is a similar analysis of year-over-year growth versus return on invested capital, which is looking at how do companies manage assets with growth strategies. And resiliency looks at the tightness of the pattern. And I'll go through some examples so that you can see the difference in the patterns. So our first step is to basically take the orbit charts, do the study of patterns, ask the question, are we seeing improvement? If companies rank within the upper 2/3 of their industry grouping by NAICS codes, they pass step 1 and they move to step 2, which is an analysis of value. Now, this year we included the value step, which is the first year we've done it, which is comparing how that company does on the ratio of market price to tangible book. And market price is what the price of the stock is, and tangible book looks at the current value of tangible assets. Now, we don't include intangibles because of reporting issues of goodwill and patents and brand identity. And we think intangibles really cannot be affected by the supply chain leader, but we think the supply chain leader has a direct responsibility on market price to tangible assets. They're making the decisions on assets. The next step we ask is that company performing better than the peer group? And you'll often find that a company who's low in performance will drive higher levels of improvement. It's sort of like the TV show The Biggest Loser. The guy that has the most to lose will actually have the most loss on the scale in the show, and it's similar. And it's hard to drive improvement when you're at a very high level of performance. And you'll see in this analysis that only a few companies have been successful in doing this. So the performance factors are revenue growth, operating margin, inventory turns, and return on invested capital. And again, we're looking at those averages for the period of time of 2009 to 2015. And we group that into two different categories that I'll show you in a minute. So the supply chains to admire is industry specific, it's based upon ratios, and it answers the three questions of, do companies drive improvement, are they driving value, and are they performing better than their peer group? And now let me go through and explain the methodology, and then I'll reveal the winners. So when I wrote the book, Bricks Matter, I had worked with about 600 companies in my work as an analyst, and I wanted to celebrate 30 years of supply chain excellence. 2012, when the book was published, was the 30th anniversary of supply chain management. And I had worked in software sales, and I had believed that if companies took technology, which the average company is spending 1.7% of revenue on technology, that they can invest in technology and process improvement, and they could drive improvement on a path much like the one depicted at the intersection of inventory turns and operating margin. I believe that the supply chain leader sits at the intersection of customer service, inventory turns, and operating margin. It's within their circle of control. Now, I would like to base the supply chains to admire on those three metrics, but I cannot find a good industry standard definition and database for customer service. But I can look closely at inventory turns and operating margin. So let me show you how this works as we look at the orbit charts. Because what we find is that over 90% of companies are not making improvement at these two intersections. And I'm going to show you some examples. So in the writing of the book Bricks Matter, I interviewed 36 companies in qualitative interviews, very senior supply chain leaders. And I asked, which companies do you think did the best on driving supply chain value? And the number one company was Procter & Gamble, and then I would hear Apple, and I would hear Walmart. Now you can see Procter & Gamble in the period of 2006, if you take the dots and you connect the lines, 2006 to 2007 made improvement on both operating margin and inventory turns. Then they started to slip backward on operating margin about the time that they purchased Gillette. And you can see in the period from 2010 to the current state of 2015, which is the last full year reporting, they have constantly slid backwards in operating margin, losing about 4 percentage points. Now, the best scenario would have said that Procter & Gamble would have driven improvement in both inventory turns and operating margin. They are disqualified on the first cut on improvement because they have not. But also Procter & Gamble does not meet the price to tangible book value criteria or the performance criteria. But this is an orbit chart, and this is the first step in really determining improvement. Now let me give you a couple of other examples. Here's Colgate-Palmolive. Colgate-Palmolive, on average, has performed better than Procter & Gamble on the operating margin measure. So it's 21% operating margin. But you can see in 2015, they're about at the same level they were at 2006, a little bit backwards in margin and a little bit better on inventory turns. But the path has definitely not been one of improvement. And then if we look at someone like Kellogg, you can see that in the period of time of 2013 to 2015, Kellogg lost about 12 percentage points in operating margin, and they are going slightly ahead in inventory turns. But again, it is not a pattern of supply chain improvement. Likewise, if we compare Dow and DuPont, you can see that Dow made some improvement in operating margin for the period of 2012 to 2015, slight improvement in inventory turns. And you can also see DuPont is at a much lower level in 2015 than they were in 2006. So the patterns matter, and what we're doing in the index is we're mining the patterns. Now, some companies might say, well, I'll just lean out my supply chain. And if I lean out my supply chain and I apply the tactics of lean, then I can drive a supply chain to admire. But that is not what we find. And in fact, if lean was the only answer, then you would say that Honda and Toyota should be in the supply chains to admire, and they're not. If you look at Toyota, you can see that it's a circular path, and 2014 they're about the same level of 2006, but they really took it hard in the recession, and then they fought back on operating margin. And in a similar path, Honda also went backwards, has not regained all the ground at 2006, but they've regained some. But again, it's not a pattern of supply chain improvement in this period of time. Now, on the orbit charts, we always show the averages. So here, Toyota has an average operating margin of 5% and an inventory turn level of 13.7, and Honda has a 6% operating margin and a 9% or 9.3 inventory turns. So you've got to really look at all of these metrics as a balanced portfolio. And I'll show you one more example of orbit charts, and then we'll get to the rest of the presentation. This is pharmaceutical. Now, it's interesting that no pharmaceutical company wins in the 2009 to 2015 analysis. What we find is that most of the pharmaceutical companies are at the same level that they were in 2006, as you can see in Bristol-Myers Squibb. Lots of mergers and acquisitions. The supply chain's a complex system. Mergers and acquisitions will often throw us out of balance. But notice that Bristol-Myers Squibb is more resilient than Merck. Merck is in green, Bristol-Myers Squibb is in blue. Resiliency is defined by the size of the pattern. We believe that supply chain leaders should have a reliable and consistent pattern in their performance. So that's a little bit about improvement. We measure improvement by the supply chain index, which is looking at the vector analysis of the orbit charts at the intersection of inventory turns and operating margin and growth and return on invested capital. And I've just showed you examples of companies that are not making improvement in their orbit charts at inventory turns and operating margin. I've tried to pick examples that many companies think are supply chain leaders that are cross-industry so that you can see that the pattern is pervasive and that it often is the case that we think a company is doing well, but when we look at the balance sheet numbers, we do not see the progress. So in our research, we try to answer the question why. And what we're trying to do is to help supply chain leaders to better drive value and to align to the balance sheet. And the answer to why really comes down to a focus on 5 issues. One, most companies have focused on very functional metrics, functions of source, make, deliver. Perhaps it's transportation metrics or manufacturing metrics, and only 12% of companies can actually see total cost. And when I talk to companies about managing costs, I say it's a lot like a decathlete when they enter the Olympic Stadium in Rio. You know, in the management of the decathlon, what the athlete wants to do is really focus on the holistic goal, knowing that they may place second or third with any one particular segment of the decathlon. Well, without the ability to look at total cost, what happens is procurement will fight transportation, transportation will fight manufacturing, will sub-optimize the whole, and we won't actually be able to drive value. This is despite all the efforts with driving very, very deep continuous improvement programs. Likewise, we will find that companies will focus on singular metrics and pat themselves on the back that they've done a good job. This may be a focus on cash to cash, or a focus on inventory turns, or a focus on cost. But we find very few companies have actually worked on the balanced portfolio. We also find that if companies focus on the balanced portfolio, there's a higher correlation to market capitalization and price to tangible book. Now, in this journey, we find that when companies change leaders frequently, that they'll have issues. You know, the definition of supply chain excellence will vary from company to company, and as you get a different leader into a company, they may bring the paradigm of the prior company, which will have typically a focus on one or two metrics, but not on the balanced portfolio. The other issue we see is we've built global supply chains. We've had more of a focus on transactions, order to cash, procure to pay, and less of a focus on planning excellence. And the companies that do this the best have a strong focus on planning and network design with a tie of these programs to supply chain strategy. They designed things like push-pull decoupling points and form and function of inventory, and they talk about supply chain strategies. And the design changes and is really integrated into the horizontal processes of sales and operations planning and supplier development. The other thing that we find is that companies that adopt fads, new programs, or perhaps have multiple consultants in an account, and they're always changing the focus, will often also have issues making the supply chains to admire. So as you think through the results, I want you to keep in front of you that the focus should be on horizontal processes: sales and operations planning, revenue management, corporate social responsibility, supplier development, and the tight integration with new product launch. That it needs to be built on a balanced scorecard. You may not agree with the balanced scorecard that I'm going to present today, but you should pick a balanced scorecard for yourself that focuses on growth, cost, turns, and also asset strategies. Consistency of leadership and culture wins. And when we have a clear definition of supply chain excellence, we also see the definition of value. Now, let's just go back and think about the process. So we first align on the supply chain index, which tells us improvement. Then we do the relative positioning against the peers for price to tangible book. And then we select companies that are higher performing on the performance factors. And again, the performance factors are growth, operating margin, inventory turns, and return on invested capital. And the supply chain index is well documented on our website. There are a couple reports on the index, but it's a vector analysis on the orbit charts looking at three factors: balance, strength, and resiliency. And then we combine those factors to ask the question, are the companies driving year-over-year improvement? Then the next test is the company better than its industry average on price to tangible book? And in this case, we throw out outliers. So, for example, General Motors and the bailouts post-recession is an outlier. We throw them out. But if a company is at or above the average for price to tangible book, then we continue to rank them in the performance factors. And price to tangible book is really market price divided by tangible book for the period. And the period that we're using is the period of 2009 to 2015. Then we look at performance factors, and the performance factors are based upon the balanced portfolio that has the highest correlation to market capitalization, which is year-over-year growth. We use operating margin as our measure for profitability. You could also use EBITDA, but we find that cost of goods sold does not work as well, and that's really a long discussion, not more than I have time here. And on cycles, we use inventory turns. We do not use cash to cash, and cash to cash is a compound metric of days of receivables plus days of inventory minus days of payables. And anytime we use a compound metric, then it's really hard to have clear communication. But inventory turns we find is a good measure of this particular cycle. It's something that people care about, and we use a cost of goods analysis for the calculation of inventory turns that I'll go over in a minute. And on return on invested capital, we use ROIC versus return on assets because it has a higher correlation to market cap. So inventory turns equals the cost of goods sold divided by inventory. In prior years of the analysis, we used revenue divided by inventory, so there's a slight change there on the calculation of inventory turns. And return on invested capital equals operating income plus income tax total divided by total shareholder equity. So in summary, we take an improvement ranking. We say, is the supply chain driving improvement at a faster rate than the peers? We then ask the question, is the company driving value for shareholders on tangible assets? And then we look at the 4 performance factors. Now, when we do the analysis, we divided 293 public companies into 26 industry peer groups based upon the industry codes. And we looked at the peer groups for improvement value and performance across 2 time periods, 2006 to 2015. And we decided 2009 to 2015 was a more valid comparison, but I am going to show you the companies that qualify for both. But before I do, let's just take a moment and celebrate the winners. 16 companies qualify on all the metrics. They qualify on improvement, they qualify on price to tangible book, and all 4 of the performance factors. And you can see that's Carter's. Carter's is an apparel company, Whole Foods, Dollar Tree, Walmart, and Target, and we see that the retail industries are making improvement. In the process industries, it was L'Oreal, Clorox Company, and BASF. We find that the process companies in aggregate are losing ground. We find that more discrete companies are actually driving improvement. It's Apple, Cooper Tires, Cisco, TSMC, and TSMC is one of the few companies that I think has done a great job on creating value networks. Cummins Engine, which is an incredible case study, Steelcase, and Edwards Lifescience in medical device. Now on the outside, we have the finalists, which are VTech, EMC, Qualcomm, Celestica, Intel, Caterpillar, Medtronic, Coloplast, and Becton Dickinson in medical device. And in the process industries, it's Coca-Cola, Hershey, Estee Lauder, and Statoil. And in the apparel and retail, it's Lululemon, TGX, PVH, Under Armour, VF Corp, Lowe's, and Chipotle, the restaurant brand. Now, what you do not see here is Procter & Gamble or Unilever or Starbucks or McDonald's or perhaps many other companies that would come to mind that you think are supply chain leaders. And, you know, this is a measure of supply chain leadership, but I think it's a fact-based analysis. And I'm not saying it's perfect, but I think that it cannot be a beauty contest. I think it has to be data-driven. And when we look at the supply chains to admire winners and finalists, the longer period of 2006 to 2015 and the shorter period of 2009 to 2015, there are a couple of very interesting patterns that I see. First, there are very few companies that are able to drive into the winner's circle for both sets of years. You can see that Cisco Systems is one of them, Apple is another, Whole Foods is another, Cummins Engine is one. You can also see that CVS and Dollar Tree are in the winner's circle consistently, Edwards Lifesciences, and TSMC. But other companies are either going upwards or backwards, right, against that. And, you know, the finalists, you know, are also in a very elite group because if you think about it, the combination of the winners and finalists represent less than 5% of all publicly held companies that are manufacturers, distributors, or retailers. So this is a very elite group that has really driven high levels of performance improvement and value for their shareholders. Now let's look at some of the orbit charts. And as we do this, I want you to, in your mental model, and we will share all these slides, compare these orbit charts to the first set of orbit charts where you saw companies going backwards. This is Cummins Engine. You know, when I interviewed Cummins Engine, which I'm hoping that they'll be able to speak at our Supply Chains to Admire section at our Global Summit, they said, you know, one of the things they think really drove improvements in performance for them was consistent leadership and avoidance of fads. Focus on horizontal, data-driven processes and clarity of supply chain strategy. When I talked to Cisco Systems, if you remember, Cisco Systems had a real kick in the gut when e-commerce sales faltered in 2002, and Cisco Systems built value chain systems going from the customer's customer, supplier's supplier, one of the strongest planning, network design, and value design for their suppliers and contract manufacturing that I've ever seen, and Cisco Systems drove higher levels of improvement. Whole Foods was based upon a new model to bring a different brand identity to healthy eating through grocery, and they redefined their supply chain process to do that. And you can see that from 2006 to 2014, there was a pretty steady improvement for a new company, a little bit of setback for 2015, but definitely a better pattern than the ones that we saw at the beginning of the webinar. And then Apple, with some of the changes in leadership, went from a pure focus on operating margin, and you see that shift at about 2011 where they start to actually look at the combination of operating margin and inventory turns, and they make the winner's circle as well. So let's just step back and think, what is this all about? And for me, this is about a focus of balanced metrics. It isn't a singular metric, it's the combination of metrics, and it's the clarity of cross-functional processes to deliver balance sheet performance. And a lot of times we find it starts with culture and leadership and a clear understanding of balance sheet. When I go to companies and I talk about price to tangible book or return on invested capital, they'll say, stop, Laura, what does that mean? And what is the difference between inventory turns and days of inventory and cash to cash? And one of the important pieces of culture and leadership is to get really clear on that and to get really clear on the strategy and avoid fads. And the way we do that to be able to link cross-functionally is to get strong horizontal processes. And again, those are the processes of revenue management, price, promotions, how are we going to market, sales and operations planning, the connection of sales and operations planning to new product launch, the connection of those processes to supplier development and building strong networks, and then tying it together with corporate social responsibility. And that strong horizontal process with clear leadership and a balanced portfolio, I think, drives supply chain excellence. Allison, I'm excited to see some of the questions. Why don't we take some now?
Sure. So some of the questions we have, Laura, how do you link financial measures that are not directly related to supply chain metrics? For example, revenue growth for non-supply chain measures.
Yeah, so I think this is an interesting question, Allison, because it gets to how do you define supply chain. So I define supply chain as the processes that go from the customer's customer to the supplier's supplier. So I consider growth to be a supply chain metric. And companies that have a more functional view at perhaps define supply chain as transportation or customer service may struggle with my approach. And I think that it gets to the definition of supply chain. I think as we get closer to the future of supply chain 2030, it's going to become real important that companies really align the supply chain for growth and think about supply chain as the engine of growth, to listen, to test and learn and adapt. And I think growth is very much a supply chain metric.
All right, we have another question. It's company specific. Can you explain why P&G and Unilever did not make the list?
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about the Procter & Gamble orbit chart and the fact that they are moving on a more singular metric strategy against inventory turns. When you look at our tables in the Supply Chains to Admire report, you'll see that Procter & Gamble is significantly underperforming on return on invested capital and price to tangible book. So Procter & Gamble doesn't meet any of the three metrics, nor does Unilever. And, I think that, we need to overperform and drive improvement. And I think a lot of that comes from the design of the global supply chain and the merger and acquisition strategy and the change in leadership in both companies.
All right, we have another company-specific question. Which innovations for companies like L'Oreal made in their supply chain help them to be winners?
So I actually had the great honor to write the L'Oreal case study a couple years ago, and I was talking to Emmanuel about, what drove supply chain improvement, and it was really around the management of complexity. L'Oreal is one of the few companies I know of where the COO will actually ask questions about forecast accuracy, and they do cost to serve regularly on a quarterly basis to say which products should come in and out of the line. And they also are very focused on how do they have global governance with regional execution in a matrix organization. And they've spent a lot of time building human capital. So I'm very proud to see L'Oreal on the list.
All right. Here's another question. What tools are these companies using for greater supply chain visibility and faster decision making?
So we find that companies that score themselves the best will rate themselves higher on the ability to get to data and supply chain visibility. Now we find there's not one tool set that does that better than another. Instead, it gets to strategy. We find that when companies deploy cloud-based analytics for reporting so they can go across heterogeneous systems, they do better. And when they have actually deployed multi-tenant architectures for supply chain visibility, that they have a higher level of satisfaction. It gets beyond an ERP-centric mindset around what supply chain looks like.
All right, we have one final question. Looks like it's in two parts, or maybe it's a backup. Is understanding the concepts of value creation essential to driving performance improvement? And do you think this is a well-understood concept? Followed up by, how do you define value creation? Are you using growth, resiliency, margin, etc.?
So I don't think it's clear what drives value, and a lot of times I'll look at supply chain strategy documents and they'll say that they want to drive value. And I'll say, how do you define value? And, they'll look at me like I'm the dumbest analyst in the world. And that's why I've really gone through a lot of thinking around what defines value and ended up with Price to Tangible book. When I wrote the book Bricks Matter and I talked about the journey from a cost-based agenda to a value-based agenda, I actually interviewed about 10 supply chain leaders and could not find a consistent definition. So people may decide that Price to Tangible book is not the best metric, but I'm hoping it starts a really great discussion in the supply chain industry. So no, I don't think it's well understood, but I think it needs to be, and I'm putting one out there for people to debate.
Great. So that wraps up all of our questions. Laura, any final thoughts before we close on the webinar?
Well, I'm hoping, Allison, that people join us at the upcoming Global Summit. It's our annual summit, and we really try to focus on 5 themes. The supply chains to admire, so we will have companies from the supply chains to admire Winner's Circle coming and speaking. We'll also have an economist focus on what does 2030 look like and the changing economies. We'll talk about how to make the digital pivot, how do companies define digital. We'll talk about supply chain transformation and continuous improvement. And we'll also be talking about situational leadership and driving supply chain talent. So at the conference, we have a great lineup of people to network. We designed this for networking, and we have some great keynote speakers. Doris Kearns-Goodwin is our speaker for situational leadership and how presidents made decisions in the face of uncertainty. And I picked that speaker because I think it's very similar to the supply chain leader facing 2030. I don't think we've ever had more uncertainty in the global economy and the shifting of technologies and the shifting of the workforce. And I think it's really a good case study for us to sit back and listen to the stories that Doris has. And we did a podcast recently with Doris, and she talked about how Lincoln was a wonderful storyteller and how he brought together his team of rivals because they had different opinions and they didn't agree, but Lincoln got insight. And so many times I think we try to manage through consistency on really getting like minds together. And I think diversity of thought, I think the storytelling, I think simple, clear messages is really great essence to get from what Doris is going to talk about. And also, I can't think of a better place to do this conference than the Phoenician. It's great networking. It's a beautiful spot. And it's our third year of doing the conference, and I think it'll be a great time. So I look forward to seeing people there. And, Allison, as you know, because you help us with this a lot, we are driving a lot of the research and the countdown for the summit online, on our LinkedIn page, on Twitter, on our blog sites, and we will be broadcasting the summit live. So if companies can't make the summit and they want to set up a TV in a room so that people can live stream it, they can. And we'll also be showing the summit videos and slides on Beat Fusion along with the metrics that matter work. And Beat Fusion is our online community for supply chain professionals everywhere. This is where anyone in the supply chain can share thought-leading information, and what we want to do is drive a different discussion. So those are my thoughts. Allison, any from you?
Well, actually, Laura, you just stole all my thunder with my wrap-up, so I appreciate that. So what I'll do now is just wrap up the webinar and thank you for your time and thank everyone for joining us. As I did mention earlier, we're going to send out the slides and recording link to everybody, so stay tuned and keep an eye out on your inbox. And we do encourage you to engage with us in social media, as Laura mentioned, on Twitter, joining our LinkedIn page, and following us on SlideShare. There's a lot of great information. And also to sign up for our newsletter that went out today, and we do that every month. And of course, we do hope that you're able to join us in Scottsdale this September 7th through 9th. There's a lot of great content, and speakers are going to be there, so lots coming forward about the supply chains to Meyer. So thanks, everybody, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Allison.